At 11:14 in the morning on January 11th, 1944, there's a thin band of sunlight above Germany and a sea of cloud below it, and in the middle, 60 American bombers grinding west toward home. They're B-17 flying fortresses. 10 men per airplane, hundreds of miles from England, heavy, slow, and built like flying brickwork. And they are not alone. Above them, a P-51B Mustang makes a wide, careful circle, one fighter, one pilot, watching the sky in front of the formation come alive with movement. 30 or more German fighters tip their noses down and start the dive. It's the kind of dive bomber crews recognize instantly. Not a pass, not a probe, a commitment. The Luftwaffe is coming in to tear the formation apart. The Mustang pilot is Major James H. Howard. He's 33 years old. Quiet in the way men get when they've already seen combat and lived through it. He's flown before, hard fighting, real fighting, long before he ever saw the winter skies of Europe. But today isn't the same kind of war. In China, the fight was often quick, sudden, close, a handful of fighters, a burst of fire, a break into cloud, a scramble back to base. Over Germany, it's math. The bomber stream is a slow-moving highway of metal and men. German radar sees it. Controllers vector fighters toward it. Interceptors launch, climb, and arrive in waves because the bombers can't vanish. They can't sprint. They can't hide. And if the bombers don't have escort where the German fighters want them, deep inside the Reich, then the Luftwaffe doesn't have to win the war. It only has to win the next 30 minutes. That's why people back home called the P-51B a miracle, and the men in charge called it dangerous. Because escorting bombers deep into Germany meant flying farther than fighters were ever supposed to fly. It meant trusting range figures that looked good in paperwork and looked terrifying in the cockpit. It meant betting your life on a new engine, a new fuel system, and drop tanks that had to work perfectly, because if something went wrong out there, you didn't get to make a heroic landing on some friendly airfield. You went down into enemy territory, or you ran out of fuel and glided until gravity finished the job. For months, the bomber offensive had been bleeding. In 1943, American bombers went deep without a long-range shield, and the Luftwaffe punished them for it. There were days when bomber groups came home with gaps you could see from miles away. Entire boxes missing, entire crews gone. There was a day in October, Black Thursday, when 60 B-17s were lost in one mission, and more than 600 airmen became casualties in a single day. Not because they lacked courage, because courage doesn't stop cannon shells and it doesn't create fighter escort where there is none. After that, daylight bombing wasn't just costly, it was on the edge of becoming unsustainable. And so the US gambled on an airplane that could change the shape of the sky. The Mustang. Fast, long-legged, sleek in a way other fighters weren't. A machine built to keep speed, to keep altitude, to keep going when other escorts had to turn back. And still, early on, people called it Suicidal for long-range escort, because the first units to fly it weren't just flying a new fighter, they were testing a theory with their own bodies. Could one fighter actually stay with the bombers where it mattered most? Could it get there, fight, and get home? Could it do that again tomorrow? The 354th Fighter Group was among the early Mustangs pushing those limits. Pilots called them pioneers for a reason. They were the ones who found out what worked by doing it and what failed by nearly dying. And on January 11th, the sky chose a moment to demand proof in the harshest way possible. The mission is a deep strike into Germany against aircraft production targets. It's the kind of mission that forces the Luftwaffe to respond, because if you can cripple the enemy's ability to build fighters, you don't just win battles, you win the months ahead. The bomber formation drops its load and turns for home. That turn is supposed to be relief. But every experienced bomber crew knows the truth. Egress can be worse than ingress, because on the way in, you still have cohesion, altitude, timing, and plan. On the way out, you're damaged, you're scattered, your formation is tired, your gunners are strained, and your engines are already running hotter than you want. And the Germans know exactly where you are. They don't have to guess. They don't have to search. They simply wait, then strike when the escorts are thin and the bombers are heavy. Howard's Mustang flight arrives in the middle of that chaos. His group engages. Fighters tangle. A sky full of twisting contrails and sudden flashes of sunlight off wings. In the confusion, Howard loses contact with his group. Not a dramatic decision, not a heroic moment, just the brutal Rand of combat at speed. A break, a turn, a chase, a split-second choice, and suddenly your wingman is gone and your radio is filled with nothing but someone else's panic. Most escort doctrine tells you exactly what to do next. Regroup. Find friendlies. Don't go hunting alone in enemy airspace. Because lone fighters are targets. Lone fighters get ambushed. Lone fighters get dragged away from the thing they're supposed to defend. Howard does what any escort leader would do. He returns toward the bomber formation. And when he reaches bomber level, he sees the nightmare. The bombers are being heavily attacked, and there are no other friendly fighters close enough to matter. This is the moment where the entire story becomes simple. Not easy. Not safe. Simple. 30 or more German fighters are pressing the bombers. One Mustang is in position to contest them. Howard has a choice. He can wait and try to assemble his group. He can search for support. He can do the rational thing. Or he can do the only thing that helps the bombers right now. He turns into the enemy. He doesn't hesitate long enough for fear to become a plan. He pushes the nose down, builds speed, and enters the fight alone. From inside the bomber formation, it's hard to understand what you're seeing at first. A B-17 crew sees movement as shapes and flashes. A fighter crosses the field of view, small and fast, and the gunners struggle to identify it, friend or enemy, because at that distance all fighters look like threats. But then they notice the pattern. The Mustang isn't slipping away, it's coming back, again and again. It appears above the formation, dives through the attackers, then climbs and returns to the space between the bombers and the enemy. That space is everything, because German fighters want clean passes, head-on or from the rear quarter, where they can aim at engines, cockpits, wing roots. They want to choose a bomber that's lagging and finish it. They want the formation to loosen, to split, to create stragglers, because stragglers die quickly. Howard's job, alone, becomes a brutal rhythm. Disrupt, reset, disrupt. He doesn't need to destroy every attacker. He needs to break their timing. He needs to force them to defend themselves instead of attacking the bombers. A fighter that's defending is not shooting. A fighter that's breaking off is not lining up a bomber. A fighter that's forced to dive away and climb again is burning fuel and losing position and losing the clean geometry of the kill. So Howard attacks with what the Mustang gives him, speed and aggression. He dives into formations that outnumber him so badly that the sensible part of the mind screams to pull away. He presses in close enough that German pilots have to react. And when they react, their attacks on the bombers lose shape. They scatter. They reform. They try again. Howard hits them again. This continues, not for a dramatic 10 seconds, not for a quick cinematic pass, but for the kind of time that makes your arms heavy and your mouth dry and your vision narrow. Minutes, then more minutes. The bombers are still moving west. The ground below is still enemy territory. The German fighters keep arriving, keep circling, keep trying to push through. And Howard stays. From the outside, it looks insane. From the inside, it feels like the only thing holding a door shut. This is where the Mustang's reputation as suicidal becomes real in the cockpit. Because long-range escort isn't a sprint. It's a marathon with a knife fight at the end. You have fuel to manage, but combat doesn't care about your plan. You have guns, but guns don't always cooperate after high-speed maneuvers and cold air and vibration. You have an engine that has to run flawlessly for hours, and if it coughs at the wrong time, you don't get to try again. Howard's fight drags on, and the Mustang begins to degrade the way all machines do when pushed hard in conditions they were never designed to make comfortable. Near the end of the engagement, 3 of his guns go out of action. Think about what that means in the air. Your entire advantage in a fighter is the threat you represent, your ability to punish an attacker who doesn't respect you. When your guns fail, you become less of a threat and the enemy senses it, not with a magical sixth sense, with experience, with observation, with the way you can no longer press certain angles because you can't afford to waste what little firepower still works, and at the same time, Howard's fuel becomes dangerously low. This is the kind of low fuel that changes your thinking, The kind where the needle doesn't just move, it sinks. The kind where you stop thinking in hours and start thinking in minutes. The kind where you know that one extended chase, one long climb at full power, one more aggressive turn at the wrong time can mean you don't make it back across the water. Now, escort doctrine would tell you to disengage. You have done enough. You have fought alone. You have bought time. You are low on fuel. Your guns are failing. You have no wingman. You are deep in Germany. Leave now and you might get home. Stay and you might not. But the bombers are still under pressure. And for the men in those B-17, might not has never been a choice they were given. So Howard continues. He keeps making attacks despite the almost impossible odds against him. He keeps forcing breaks. He keeps presenting the Luftwaffe with a problem it cannot ignore. A Mustang that refuses to leave, appearing again and again in the approach lanes, turning German attack runs into messy, hurried, defensive maneuvers. And something else begins to happen. Something that doesn't show up in bullet counts or mechanical failure reports. The psychology shifts. German pilots are trained to expect rational behavior. They're trained to expect that a lone fighter will disengage when it loses advantage. They're trained to expect that an escort will protect by staying close and acting conservatively, because escorting bombers is not supposed to be a dueling contest. It's supposed to be controlled. Howard is not controlled. He is aggressive in a way that doesn't fit the pattern. So the longer he stays, the more dangerous he seems, not because he becomes stronger, but because his behavior suggests there is something the Germans can't see. A trap, hidden fighters, a coordinated ambush. Because why else would a lone Mustang stay this long? That doubt is worth more than ammunition. Because a fighter pilot who doubts hesitates, and hesitation ruins timing. And timing is everything when you're trying to kill a bomber inside a tight formation of guns. Howard, with failing weapons and dwindling fuel, uses presence as a weapon. Even when he cannot destroy every attacker, he can still force them to break. He can still threaten. He can still deny them clean passes. He can still make the bombers feel, if only for a few more minutes, that they are not abandoned. And then, slowly, the pressure begins to ease. Not because the Luftwaffe suddenly becomes cowardly, not because they stop wanting the kills, but because the window is closing. The bomber formation is moving towards sections of the route where the German fighters can't press as freely. The escort picture is changing. The opportunity to methodically tear apart the formation is slipping away. And Howard has held long enough for that to happen. When the bombers land and crews climb down stiff-legged and shaking, the debriefing rooms fill with a kind of excitement that doesn't happen often in bomber war. They tell the same story again and again. A single Mustang. One fighter. Staying with them. Fighting for what felt like forever. Driving off attacks that should have killed men. And the higher-ups do what they always do when they hear something that sounds too dramatic to be real. They verify it. They check records. They check mission logs. They identify the Mustang pilot, Major James H. Howard. The official account credits him with destroying 3 enemy aircraft during the engagement and probably destroying or damaging others. But the numbers are not the reason the story spreads, because bomber crews don't remember him as a tally. They remember him as the difference between order and collapse. They remember him as the one fighter they saw still there when everything else suggested they should be alone. They remember the feeling of seeing a Mustang slide into position and knowing someone, somewhere, still cared whether they made it home. And that's why Howard receives the Medal of Honor. Not because he chased glory, because he stayed. Because he attacked a formation of more than 30 enemy aircraft alone. Because he fought for about 30 minutes in conditions that should have forced a disengagement. Because even when his guns failed and his fuel became dangerously low, he continued to press, trying to protect the bombers from fighters that wanted to turn them into fire and falling bodies. This is the moment that changes how people talk about the Mustang. Before this, it's a promising airplane, a controversial solution, a theory with a lot of optimism and a lot of fear behind it. After this, it's proof. Proof that long-range escort can work. Proof that the bombers don't have to fly naked deep over Germany. Proof that the Luftwaffe can't simply wait for the escorts to turn back and then feast on the bomber stream. And when you change that, you change the entire air war, because the bomber offensive is not won by one heroic fight. It is won by the accumulation of missions that succeed, by the weeks where crews return often enough that the force doesn't collapse under attrition. It is won when the enemy can no longer pick the moment of maximum vulnerability. It is won when German pilots look up and realize the escorts are still there, over the target, on the way out, deep in the sky they used to own. But there's something else in this story that matters, something that doesn't fit neatly into doctrines and aircraft performance charts. The Mustang wasn't suicidal because it was weak. Long-range escort was suicidal because it demanded a kind of endurance and discipline that pushed pilots to the edge and then demanded they fight anyway. Deep over Germany, you don't just fight the enemy. You fight distance, you fight fuel, you fight fatigue, you fight cold, you fight the temptation to do the sensible thing and save yourself. On January 11th, 1944, Major James H. Howard looked at the situation and understood the math instantly. 30 or more enemy fighters, bombers under attack, no friendly fighters close enough to matter, and one Mustang in the right place. He could have waited. He could have tried to regroup. He could have done what the book recommends when you're alone and outnumbered. Instead, he turned into the enemy and kept turning into them again and again for about 30 minutes until the bombers could get away. That's why the story endures. Not because it's neat, not because it's comfortable, because it's a reminder that sometimes the impossible part of a battle isn't the machine or the numbers, it's the decision. They laughed at the Mustang. They called it suicidal for long-range escort. And then, over Germany, one pilot faced more than 30 attackers alone and proved that the fighter wasn't the weak link. The only weak link was the moment you decided to leave. And Howard didn't leave. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more forgotten moments like this, where technology meets doctrine, doctrine meets reality, and one person makes the decision that changes everything. Tell me where you're watching from, and what story you want next.